Good morning.
Hello. Can you hear me? I'm trying to zoom on in the web browser here.
It's a little choppy on the audio.
Oh no.
Give it 2 more minutes for everyone else to show up.
Sure. I'm going to also plug into a better internet potentially. And better speaker maybe, I'm not sure. Chaos.
Give it 1 more minute. Okay, 3 minutes in, let's get started. Stephen, I think you have the agenda today.
Yeah, pretty much. So we started a while back scrubbing the use case documents, and we spent a while discussing the cluster registry one, but we didn't really get into the cluster set one. And given that that's sort of the parent concept, I thought it was worth discussing that one perhaps a little bit more. And also discussing whether it makes sense to actually merge them.
Completely agree. Looking at the 2 items that you had here, though, I think maybe it makes sense to start with the second one.
Second one,
yeah, really quick.
Yeah, probably.
So is the MCS API ready for external use with the V1 Alpha 1 caveats? Yes, I think so. That's, from my perspective, it's been ready since we pushed up to the SIGs repo. I don't know if anyone disagrees there, but yeah, I think we are, with the V1 Alpha 1 caveats, absolutely. And then, hopefully we can start, it looks like we've got a few implementations in flight, so hopefully we can start narrowing that down and get closer to beta and lift those restrictions. But yeah, I think, from what we've seen, I don't imagine it changing drastically in the near term.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. All right, so we'll start using that one then, probably.
Awesome.
Providing feedback.
Awesome. Yeah. Feedback, please. So with that, let's dive in. Do you want to share, or I can share, maybe?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, if you can share, that might just be.
Sure. Let me bring up the right things. All right. So yeah, I'll start with cluster set. Can you see that all right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so should we just kind of go through and talk through the use cases I see that there's already some comments. We probably should have done this a while ago, so thanks, Stephen, for adding it to the agenda. So I think the first couple that I added were really just meant as starters, kind of based on the other conversations that we've had in the SIG. And so maybe not too controversial, but it looks like there's some good comments here. So I think the first one was kind of the ownership access consistency. This is really just kind of an extension of what we kind of agreed to with that namespace sameness position statement, that the owner should own their namespace in all of the clusters in a cluster set. And I think my second bullet here is really just kind of a corollary. If I own the same namespace, or if I own the namespace in all my clusters, then I want to have the same access in those clusters. We don't want a situation, I think, where the service owner needs to think beyond kind of that namespace level, and we want to keep that consistent across namespaces.
Yeah.
And then the second one, multi-cluster services, we've been talking about that a lot. I want to be able to make my service available to other clusters in the cluster set without caring where my consumers are. I want to know that if I make it available from one cluster, I can do so from any cluster, so I don't have to think about like which cluster I'm in. Am I right to expose? And then as a consumer, and this is, I think, where it'll get interesting. As a consumer, I don't want to think about which cluster the service lives in. But Vishal had this comment here about supporting the option for a consumer to select a particular cluster. And actually, I wanted to talk about that a bit. So I'm curious what everyone thinks about this, first of all.
Yeah, well, so the points that have come up in sort of our discussions of this, and the first one I guess we've already talked about here as well, is having some idea of locality, preferring a local service if it's available to a remote one.
Yeah, that I think makes a lot of sense. But so I guess the question is that, I want to ask this differently. Is that locality related to cluster, the cluster itself, or is it more about where the cluster is located? Like if I had two clusters that were co-located, do I care in that case which where my traffic goes? Because
yeah, or if you have a stretched cluster where a service can be in the same cluster but in a different geography, as the sort of counter example. Yeah, there's some other metric, and so the locality aspect isn't really, if we think of this at a high level, it doesn't contradict this in any way. The consumer, ideally, as in the person writing the application that's, or microservice or whatever, that's connecting to the multi-cluster, doesn't want to have to think about where the service is. And where the service is and how that's handled is really an implementation detail, I think. So before we address Vishal's comment, from the consumer perspective, whatever's providing the multi-cluster, I think, should just do the right thing in the default case. And so that could be based on latency, etc., a whole pile of things, but the consumer doesn't worry about that. So then Vishal's comment is about some use cases where how the multi-cluster is set up, or, well, more accurately, where the services live, is important. And this is really related to scenarios where you have Kubernetes cluster definitions and then some other concept of a cluster. And so we come across this, for example, with Kafka setups or CockroachDB. So the sort of common denominator is that you want data replication and you want your data to be safe according to certain metrics. And to provide that, the cluster that's providing the data, data storage has to have some its own idea of what makes the data safe.
Right. And so I can look at this from a Cassandra perspective because I've got a lot more experience in that than personally. But yeah, like Cassandra is zone and region aware, or rack and data center in Cassandra terms. But yeah, it knows. It has its own replication semantics. But as a consumer, I don't know that I just want to connect to the cluster more than I want to connect to like a specific subset of endpoints. Is like with Cockroach, do you care? Do you actually care which nodes that you are talking to, or is it that Cockroach needs to internally have the ability to address certain nodes?
Yeah, it has to be able to address certain nodes, and this might actually be just really a sort of a layering problem where ultimately we're trying to do multi-cluster at the wrong level. Trying to build a clustered service on top of multi-cluster service when it's not really the right abstraction, perhaps.
Yeah, because I guess the question that comes to mind for me there with like Cockroach or some other distributed databases, I assume that internally it has its own notion of where nodes are located for its own replication semantics. And so does it care about the service that's exposed, or is it just that, like, as a consumer, do I care where those nodes are, or is this really about the database knowing its own, or that whatever?
No, it's really about the database. This is about internals, which is why I suspect this might just be a layering violation rather than an actual use case.
Okay, that's yeah, no, that's really good to dive into, because that actually, like, from the use cases I've seen, that's kind of more consistent. Like, absolutely, the pods that make up the service might care about which cluster they're located in, or I guess more accurately, which zone or region they're located in. But I don't know if that needs to actually be exposed at the service.
That's what I'm starting to think as well. It's a shame Vishal isn't here, but we'll continue.
Yeah, this would be good for follow up on. After this, we can throw a comment in here, kind of summarizing this conversation. Because what I've kind of seen more is, if you, like, the use cases where people really want to access a service in a particular cluster, at that point the service stops feeling fungible, and maybe it actually, like, even if it's the same service, running the same application, it's actually a different instance, and maybe then it needs its own name.
Yeah, because it's not equivalent, really. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so there's nothing to stop other mechanisms being put in place to provide more specific connectivity, but perhaps not multi-cluster.
Right. And I mean, like, honestly, you could have multiple services selecting the same pods if you wanted to create this different access pattern. On the other side, the topology side, I think you're right. I think doing the right thing is the right thing. And, like, as a consumer, I shouldn't care. It should just happen. And this is actually in line with a lot of the conversations I've seen in SIG networking lately about topology and rethinking. And there's actually a KEP to kind of build support for this. So, and for that, I'm not actually sure that it's multi-cluster specific at all. Like, even if I have a fairly distributed cluster, I probably still want some kind of intelligence within a single cluster. Multi-cluster just, of course, exacerbates all the problems, because you're more likely to have interesting topologies. But I think yeah, like as a consumer, hopefully I'm not I don't have to say like, don't make my traffic expensive. It just, it just happens. But yeah, the addressing is really interesting. And I think, we should keep digging into use cases there. Because I keep seeing this pattern where, either I want to address a specific cluster use case becomes, is actually, I really want two services. Like I want my US service and I want my Europe service, because I actually don't like, they have different data and they're not fungible, and I actually want them to be different services. Or it becomes like my application needs to be aware of where it is, but a service consumer really doesn't. And I'm curious if we're missing something there, and if there are use cases, or if it really is kind of these two camps, which would be great because it means that we're kind of already covering our bases. But I want to make sure that we're really
not forgetting anything.
Tracking. Yeah.
Yeah, and it fits in with what Tim's been saying a lot, where the network layer should just do the right thing.
Yeah. And I think a big part of that too comes from the fact that when we give people configuration options, that everybody ends up wanting the same exact configuration, right? Like keep it cheap unless nothing's running, and then fail over to a more expensive path. So yeah, that seems to apply here as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Should we move on to the next ones?
Yep, which are mine. So so I wrote, as a service owner, I want the option to expose a multi-cluster service externally without knowing ahead of time in which clusters of the cluster set it will be available. And I want to support informing external load balancers of the appropriate cluster to use, internally rerouting requests if a service request comes in to a cluster which doesn't host the service.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is sort of this is related to north-south load balancing, but hopefully in a sort of more generic way. So the way I was really thinking, so I wrote it just underneath. Put another way, I want to be able to load balance across a cluster set and access exposed services within the cluster set from any ingress in the cluster set. And so I was sort of thinking, with that, my last point really is, ultimately I want to be able to think of a cluster set in the same way I think of a cluster. And so we have concepts currently where we expose services in a cluster, and basically this just sort of extending that to a cluster set.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have you been following the service APIs work, the gateway API?
No, not in detail. Is that the sort of the service V+1?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Because they have, so I've actually been going there. They meet on Thursdays, and kind of making sure that this use case isn't forgotten. And I think there's some interesting developments there that will hopefully apply. But essentially the idea is that this new gateway, which is the new ingress, can point at a service, or it can point at a service import, and that would make it a multi-cluster. Or a consumer of the multi-cluster service. I think this is a really good use case here, and I think it fits well. Like if we're saying that a multi-cluster service is just the multi-cluster abstraction of a regular service, then I would expect that I can do with it the things I can do with the regular service. And ingress is a key feature there. But yeah, maybe we should kind of get some of them to loop in more here, and talk about this, because I think this is
Mm-hmm.
clearly a use case. Your next bullet, the
yeah, and so this is
yeah, go ahead.
it sort of goes to it's similar to the one that we were just discussing about, where Vishal's comment. As a service running on a cluster set, I want to control whether my requests are handled by instances in the same cluster or a different one, for replication purposes, for example. And yeah, so
That makes sense.
This really, I think, maybe we're sort of coming from the submariner angle. We're influenced by the fact that we're building MCS on top of connectivity instead of thinking about things the other way around. And so, we probably have a tendency to see MCS as a way of describing connectivity when it shouldn't really be, the more I think about it.
Yeah. At the same time, though, I do think connectivity is important. So the way I think about it is more like MCS should be about describing intent, and probably not describing connectivity. But we need to make sure that the API leaves open room for your connectivity needs. Like this use case seems like this is a very valuable use case. I'm not sure that it necessarily needs to be expressed in the API, but we need to make sure that the API doesn't preclude the implementation from making decisions like this.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I sort of wondered if this was something that's another existing API might be better suited to describe. This felt a bit like the service topology API. Then so we discussed this a while back, and Tim wasn't keen on that at all.
I think they're kind of revisiting the service topology API, and this kind of goes into what I was saying earlier, like the reasoning being that everybody actually wants the same configuration in the service topology API. So making you specify doesn't make a lot of sense, and maybe it was a little too prescriptive, and didn't let an implementation be more creative, and at a minimum just made you kind of specify redundant information. So with this, is this something that you would really need to specify with the service API, or would this be more of like an implementation specific decision?
Yeah, that's a good question, and so I'm trying to figure out if the general escape that I wrote just above under your point there, that service definition covers distribution, if that would cover it. And I suspect it would. The idea that if a consuming service really, well, a consumer in general really cares about where its requests are handled, then we can define a local service, or just give access to the local service, because obviously if we're exporting a service, then there's also a local service.
Right.
So yeah, that could be the answer there.
Yeah. Although, I know that Submariner has that ability, but I wonder if that needs to be like a general part of the API, or would exposing, like in the general case, where you can't just make cluster IP visible, would just exposing another multi-cluster service that is, like US and Europe, would that solve it well enough?
Yeah, I think it would. At the cost of some specific configuration every time, but I think, yeah, so having a US, well, two different service exports would cover cases where just distinguishing between the service yeah, so non-imported service and an imported service would. Right, so maybe that's actually what your question is leading to.
Yeah, like just if basically have we provided enough grammar to describe what's what you want to do here, and are there gaps? And then also, is it too cumbersome? Because like if this is a super common use case, then maybe it needs revisiting. But
yeah. So yeah, the two questions are always: if this is common, then we need to make it easy, and if anyone needs it, we have to make sure we don't make it impossible. And so we're not making it impossible, I don't think. Do we need to extend anything to make it easy? Yeah, that's an open question, I think, still. I don't have the answer.
Okay. Well, that's good. I like open questions. At least we can discuss them further. So, okay. Cool. Yeah. Let's keep thinking about that one and discussing it. I have I want to kind of nail this down, and also I think it was mentioned maybe in the other doc that this kind of thing is already kind of supported by headless.
Yeah.
At least in the current definition, this is maybe a good motivator to formalize that definition. I think we've kind of described headless in the KEP, but and a little bit of DNS, the bare minimum needed to make it functional, but we have not finished headless, and we haven't finished DNS. And I think that we had that listed as a graduation to beta requirement, but I think we should kind of formalize that definition, and that seems like a fine place to start, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I'm looking at the other document now.
Yeah, maybe we should flip over. Although first, your last bullet down here, I wanted to talk about because I like this one a lot. I was actually wondering if it should be its own top level. But I think in general.
Yeah. Well, so now.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, that was just the more I thought about the use cases in both documents, in the cluster registry and the cluster sets, and how they fit in with other APIs in Kubernetes, the more I was just thinking, in many scenarios, our cluster set is, or should be the same as a cluster, and we should be able to consume it in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that my mental model has been that like a producer probably needs to care where things are deployed. But a consumer really shouldn't have to. If everyone kind of does their job correctly, the consumer just kind of like, if they're outside, it's north-south, they consume by ingress. If they're inside, it's multi-cluster services, but they just want a service. A producer can figure out, capacity and various clusters and all of that, and routing, and the implementation can make sure that that it's not too expensive to use, but the consumer just wants a service name, and they want it to stay up, and they want it to handle their load.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I think this is a really good this last bullet is a really good thing for us to strive for here. Cool. Should we flip over to the other doc?
Yeah, unless anybody else has any comments on the call.
All right, lazy consensus has it. All right. Yeah, so Stephen, I don't know if you want to kind of take lead here. I think last time we spent I'm talking around your points here.
Yeah. So I don't really have anything new here apart from rethinking. Well, the need to rethink many of these at a higher level, less prescriptive.
Yeah.
I think the main topic of discussion, I think, for me here is whether it actually makes sense to merge this with the cluster set document.
Yeah, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe the cluster set document is like kind of a vision document, and this is more specifically about mechanics and what we need. I do think with some of Tim's comments last time, and Paul and I have had some chats as well. I kind of think that we have a good set of specific use cases and specific things here that I think various people would like to use a registry for. And maybe we should try to take this kind of the same way that we did with multi-cluster services and just kind of define the common API that is enough to build these things versus actually trying to describe, like, enumerate all of the actual uses that we want in a registry. Because I don't know that every registry needs to support, or every use case needs all of these features. But what is the common basis that we can build on that we want everywhere?
Yeah.
Like the first one I put down here, identification, that one seems pretty non-controversial, but if we actually dig into cluster ID, I think there's a lot there. And even just like deciding on how to identify a cluster, like the simplest case is I have a unique name, but then there's the question of, like, how do we verify that the cluster with that name is in fact that cluster? I assume there's probably some kind of self-identification that needs to be supported. Like, I should be able to kubectl get cluster ID and understand what my cluster is and what else, what else goes in that ID. Is that just a cluster local thing? Does that contain cluster set information? Does it have instruction? Like, I think there's a lot of open questions there that need to be resolved. And then, if I were to build a registry, how do I verify that Jeremy's cluster is in fact the official Jeremy's cluster and not just some other Jeremy's cluster?
Yeah.
And then access, the second one I put
here.
Especially or go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, the basic trap for this one is you have a registry and a cluster joins and disappears, and a cluster claiming to be the same one rejoins. How do you verify that?
Exactly. And to complicate that even more, it may be legitimate. That may be that my first cluster broke and I restored from a backup.
Yeah.
Maybe
so
that's
it's not
acceptable.
Quite the same, but it should replace it.
Right. So we need that notion. And then, there's also the question, I think that was in that cluster ID doc, but like user-friendly labels. Like, presumably I want to be able to name my clusters, like Europe and US, but those user-generated names and uniqueness are not friendly constraints.
Yes. Well,
then
so
you end
there
up
is
with
actually
Europe
one
too.
area where, yeah, so there is actually one area where that's important and for users, and we're exploiting that in Submariner. Clusters have unique names that are hopefully vaguely human-friendly in kube configs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but that works for a small set of clusters. But then once you start talking of tens or hundreds of clusters, it's not true anymore.
Yeah, and that's very true. So you're right, because they do have vaguely human-friendly names, but yeah, when you get to a lot of clusters, the human friendliness starts to fall off. But and then there's the question of, is that okay? Because when you have that many clusters, are you actually identifying, like as a user, are you manually selecting them, or is that when you're relying on some form of registry to select a subset of clusters for you? And then that would imply to me that this cluster ID should probably also support cluster labels.
Yeah.
I'm going to add that. Just as a note, the access, this next bullet I added, I'm actually less convinced that this is something that needs to be defined versus just supported. My initial thought on cluster registry is that it should provide you credentials. But I wonder if that is actually, if the way that happens is actually generic enough that it should be prescribed. And maybe the right answer is really more of a instructions on how to get access.
Mm-hmm.
So some kind of reference to a credential provider instead of that you could pass a cluster ID in your own credentials instead of actually storing credentials. And I think that, to me, that seems to be one of the things with the current cluster registry that doesn't quite sit well, is like it's got the notion that all controllers are kind of equal, right? And like it'll give you access, but if I remember correctly, it basically gives everybody the same access.
Yeah.
And that's almost definitely not what you want.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is the sort of area where there are many different ways of dealing with it and many different requirements. Yeah, being too prescriptive is likely to be too limiting. Yeah, because in some cases it could just be even like having certificates with a common root, and others it will have to be a whitelist. Some sort of way of verifying individual certificates. Yeah,
type this morning. Yeah, so that's, I think, we're coming up to, a little bit of time left. I'm happy to spend the rest of today on this as well, but I wonder if we shouldn't, try to regroup next week with, a different look on this, and maybe we can go through and audit these docs or specifically this one with the cluster registry, and kind of revisit the common patterns that we want to support, and maybe take this from the angle of, what should that registry API look like, more than what should the registry do?
Yeah, I think that would make sense. Yeah.
Because these are all very valid use cases. But but they are also not likely to be used, to all be used by any given consumer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else here that stands out that you'd like to kind of talk about?
Nothing that jumps out right now. I know. Well, the last one is an interesting one. What information lives in the registry? But I think so. That's another angle to explore.
Right.
But it'll take too much time.
Yeah. Actually, so yeah, so maybe I'll add another follow-up discussion for this to next week right now on the agenda. But yeah, this is a good one. Maybe we should try to think about what information lives in a registry, or maybe the wording that I would use is what information would I like to be able to derive from a registry? If that slight difference makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because this.
Yeah. And how much information is relevant completely externally? Well, I mean, any external user of the registry would want to know how much is required for services that are going to build on top of the registry, and how much is required just for the registry itself. And that gets into API discussions.
Yeah. Yeah, these are great questions. Maybe we should take a stab offline at coming up with some answers, and maybe this is use cases as well. I really like that we started with use cases and what we want to actually be able to do with this registry, because I think all of these points above really frame the conversation well around what that eventual API could look like. I think, we probably have enough for, like, even from this list, for things that external consumers want to query in a registry. I think, certainly with Submariner where it is, there's probably a good list of what we need just for services. This last one's probably hard at this point, and I think we'll probably just develop out of the others. But I think this is a good amount to think about. And then in the back of my mind, I'm very curious, honestly, if we just started with actually revisiting cluster ID, picking and choosing the concepts that we like, and starting there, how close does that get us to what we actually want out of a registry? If each cluster is uniquely identifiable, and there's a way to just reference them all. How close are we at that point to solving these use cases? My gut is fairly close, and then the gaps that are left will be interesting problems to solve.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's just about time here. Is there anything else anyone wants to talk about? All right. Well, I'll take a note personally to kind of revisit these docs over the next week, and try to add my thoughts.
I'll do the same.
Awesome. Yeah. Encourage everyone to chime in, and I'll add to the agenda right away. But thank you, everyone. And thanks, Stephen. This is some great conversation.
You're welcome.
Awesome. All right. Then see you all next week.
Yep. Bye.